Welcome to Forum Australia's webinar. It's our first webinar, well, my first webinar, perhaps it's yours as well. So grab yourself a drink in the comfort of your own home. Perhaps you've even joined us in your pajamas. We are here and we will start our forum in a moment. This is the Brave New World, and I guess the very reason why we're having this particular Forum Australia in this way is due to the topic of this particular forum, which is all about the challenges of COVID, but also the opportunities of COVID. So thanks so much for joining us. We've got a great night ahead of us, lots of wonderful speakers, and you'll have a chance to participate as well as the evening goes, and ask questions and chat with each other, share your comments, but also chat amongst yourselves on the brave new world it is. We'll be starting in a moment, probably kicking off at about 1 minute past 7, just as everybody comes. It's funny, even though we don't have to leave home to go to these events, sometimes we just run a little bit late. It's just the nature of this, but the wonders of technology. So we'll be with you in a moment. We've got 4 speakers tonight coming to us from Canberra, but 1 speaker in Sydney as well. All experts in their field, all bringing us a different angle to the evening. So thank you so much for joining us. And thanks, first of all, to dinner. If anyone enjoyed the fabulous catering from Taj Agra, as always, we would normally be meeting there for a Forum Australia event, but tonight, it just can't be. It just can't be. So here we are, and thank you. My name is Lish Fejer. I'm the breakfast presenter on ABC Radio Canberra, and I really am so pleased that you've clicked on the link, joined us tonight. This is my first experience of emceeing an online event. Perhaps it's your first experience of attending an event, but what a great opportunity seized by Forum Australia. And you are in very safe hands technologically. I think that's always important to point out. I'd like to just acknowledge the country on which I present tonight, and you can do your own acknowledgement of country on where you are, but I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and their elders past and present, and emerging. Now, if you've been part of a Forum Australia event before, you will know that these are fabulous events to be part of. You know, the topics tackled and the speakers who are tackling those topics, and tonight is no exception. A sterling lineup. We're going to start with the challenges of COVID at a broader policy level, from what the pandemic has revealed about social inequalities to how we might build back better as we recover. Then we'll move to look at COVID from a health perspective, with both physical and mental health effects of the virus and the control measures, and what living with the virus and living with the pandemic might look like. Then it's on to business and how business are dealing with the fallout, the economic fallout. And to wrap the evening, the social response on the ground. Now, each speaker will present for around 8 to 10 minutes during the talks. If questions bubble up, feel free to ask them. If you just move your cursor around on your screen, you will see a Q&A function to the bottom right of the screen. And if you click that, you can type in a question. Now, you can do that during each presenter's talks, and I will collate them and collect them throughout the evening and put them to the presenters at the end of the evening after they have all presented, and they can have a chance to answer them. You can also say you'd like all presenters to answer it, or just target it at one particular presenter. You can also have a chat with all the other people involved in the meeting tonight. Now, the chat function is another speech bubble. If you click on that, that means everyone will see what you're chatting about. So if you're inspired by some particular presentation or a point made by one of the presenters, feel free to put it up there. It's really encouraging and engaging in a way. We don't want heckling necessarily, but it's just a nice way of being able to engage in an online way when we can't all be there and hear everyone chattering and acknowledging. So that's please use that throughout the evening. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce Muhammad Ali. Now, Muhammad Ali is the man behind Forum Australia, and he has tractor-like beams with his eyes that no one can say no to whatever Muhammad Ali requests, and he is such a man that is about the community. So I'd like to introduce him just to say a few words on behalf of Forum Australia.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming over, and thank you, Lish, for being the master of ceremony. My name is Muhammad Ali, and I head Forum for this. We started this Forum Australia last 14 years. It has been working, and the idea was very simple, that everyone must and should have an opportunity to have their say. And Forum Australia is very proud that it has contributed to the thought process of almost everyone who has touched Forum Australia in one way or the other, and also that we have made kind of impact on the policy makers and movers and shakers. My respects to Ngunnawal people, and acknowledge that we are on their lands. And I think Lish, as she said, that this is not the first, but the second webinar. And I am just in my infancy to learn the techniques and all that. I must thank all of the committee members who have done so great to reach us to this wonderful seminar. There is a wonderful lineup, as Lish has just said. The speakers, they'll cover the health side, especially mental health, and then of course the business side, risks and opportunities, and as well as I think that a social impact and the policy and I think the governance side of the thing. So it's certainly a wonderful, wonderful evening ahead, and I leave it back to you people with my warmest thanks to all of the speakers and the participants. Back to Lish with great thanks.
Thank you, Muhammad Ali. Now, our first speaker for this evening, now you will see all the speakers presented so beautifully with their fabulous backdrops on the top of your screen. To kick off the evening this evening, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Sharon Bessell. Sharon is at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU here in Canberra, and she works on issues of human rights and social justice, particularly the gendered and generational nature of poverty, gender equality and social policy for children. So it's understandable that she's going to be tackling it from a very broad level, what COVID-19 has revealed about the social inequalities, its impacts on poverty, before, during and after COVID-19, because of course we're in it for the long haul. The social connectedness in times of social isolation, especially on children, and this talk of what building back better might actually mean and look like. Thank you so much, Sharon. I'll let you take the helm now.
Thanks so much, Lish. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got some slides to share. So let's hope that the technology works. And Lish is giving me the thumbs up, so that seems promising. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this evening and to share some thoughts on the challenges that we currently face. And thank you to the amazing team that's made this event happen. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and from which I'm speaking, the Ngunnawal people, and also to the traditional owners of the land on which I grew up, the Palawa people of Tasmania, and to pay my respects to leaders past, present, and emerging. So, as I thought about my comments tonight, that wonderful introductory sentence from A Tale of Two Cities came repeatedly to mind. 2020 has certainly been the worst of times. I don't think anyone could argue that it's also been the best of times. But are there glimmers of hope? Is it possible not just to survive these difficult times, but to see this as a turning point in history and to imagine a future that could indeed be the best of times? We have seen the best of humanity during this pandemic, from the incredible dedication and selflessness of healthcare professionals to the Australian Mint's release of the donation dollar very recently. And of course, we've seen the teddy bears in windows, aiming to send happy messages to children and indeed to adults. But COVID-19 has also revealed the deep inequalities and injustices in our society. This has been most clearly revealed in the terrible events in aged care homes. But COVID-19 has only surfaced what has long been a crisis that has been invisible in full view of us all. The shocking events in some aged care homes were surfaced in the Royal Commission 2 years before this crisis began. And this is only part of the story of the ways in which we've managed to find ourselves in a society that, for all its very many positives, has done badly by some and has often abandoned the most vulnerable. Children in the care of the state consistently do far, far worse than almost all others, and the majority of these children are Indigenous. We have been creating another stolen generation without stopping to think what we're doing. The Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody handed down recommendations in 1987, and most of them have never been acted upon. Black Lives Matter reminds us of this failure over 3 decades on. We continue to incarcerate, often for years, some of the world's most vulnerable, those who are seeking asylum in this wealthy country. Childcare is unaffordable for many, housing increasingly unaffordable, and we're facing a climate change emergency that resulted in the terrible summer that we endured just before we found ourselves dealing with this pandemic. Before the pandemic, 13.6% of Australians lived in poverty. That's an incredibly high number for a country that consistently ranks among those that are wealthiest and with the highest Human Development Index. The figure is nearly 18% for children. So we have pre-existing problems as well as new problems on our hands. I don't want to suggest for a moment that we should despair, but I do think we need to ponder how we got to where we are and how we can take this time of deepest crisis as a moment for change. To return to the aged care homes crisis, The Guardian reported a couple of days ago that the ways in which government funding has been used has not been to the benefit of older Australians in desperate need of better care, but by some to support profitability and dividends to shareholders. Does any of this sound familiar? Remember the Banking Royal Commission. So what we are dealing with is the loss of an ethic of care and the rise of the financialisation of care. The market can deliver much, but it cannot deliver care, and it cannot protect the vulnerable. We cannot and should not financialise or profitise care. So what can be done? This is a moment when we can think not just about how we can survive on a day-to-day basis, difficult as it sometimes is to think beyond that, but to imagining a future where we can replace terms that vilify those who are vulnerable, those who are doing it tough in our society. We need to lose terms like handouts, welfare dependency, freeloaders, and leaners rather than lifters, the kinds of terms that we're now seeing creep back into rhetoric as we talk about when to remove the COVID benefits. And we need to replace these terms with concepts of care, inclusion, fairness, and justice. We're facing the challenge of a generation as tens of thousands, possibly millions of Australians fall into poverty. But we also see the positive outcomes for people that we've been able to witness when the COVID support packages increased benefits for some, those people who had long been on government benefits and living below the poverty line. We could see how some of those people could afford so-called luxuries, such as fresh food for their children. However, as my colleague Peter Whiteford has recently noticed, once the COVID supplements are removed, we will again be amongst the lowest in the OECD, the club of wealthy countries, in terms of financial support for the most vulnerable. As we, as a country, face the present and look to the future, can we imagine a situation that doesn't rebuild old inequalities and injustices, but takes the best of what we have and builds something new? As we face the challenge of generations, climate change, can we grasp the economic opportunities and the jobs that clean energy industries offer? This sounds like an impossibly difficult plea and way beyond living with COVID-19. But if we don't grapple with these issues, we may learn to live with COVID-19, but I don't think we can live well, and I don't think we can live justly. Forums like this are where we can begin to make the journey happen. But finally, in case all of this sounds impossible on a day-to-day basis, I want to briefly share with you the findings of some research that we did a few years back with children living in a range of different situations, but many of them living in very deep disadvantage. These children were aged between 7 and 12, and I think their messages are valuable today as we think about how we live with COVID-19. This is the community jigsaw that you can see on the screen that we developed with children to explain what is most important to them. When all of the pieces are in place, children are doing well. But as those pieces fall away, children's lives become increasingly difficult. The more pieces in place, the safer, the more cared for, and the more included children feel. COVID-19 has certainly caused some of the pieces of the jigsaw to fall away very dramatically. We've had to sacrifice, at least temporarily, the community get-togethers that are so important to children and inclusive public spaces in order to keep our society safe. And financial security is disappearing for many, and these are very serious problems. But there is much of that jigsaw that can stay firmly in place as we grapple with COVID-19. We can all work to keep as many of these pieces in place as possible, particularly through the ways we treat each other, and particularly the ways in which we treat the children in our communities, whether they're children that we know and that we love, or whether they're children that are strangers to us that we meet in passing. And one of the things that children consistently said was how important it was for them in terms of the way strangers treated them and whether they treated them with a smile and with kindness. So we need to work on the big things. But if we keep the pieces of the jigsaw in place, we'll be able to better live with COVID-19 as we grapple with those huge issues. Thank you.
I feel like we should clap, but it's one of those tricky. Professor Sharon Bessell, thank you so much. That was fabulous. Now, as we're all watching and listening, no doubt you've got questions that have popped up and that you'd like to ask Sharon. Do ask them. I really want to encourage you to ask them. And a few of you have already put some questions in the Q&A tab just to the bottom right of your screen. So just write them up there. After all four speakers have presented, we will have opportunity to ask those questions and I will ask them on your behalf. If you just want to chat, feel free to press on the chat button and write something to the many other participants that have joined in this evening. Now, on to our next speaker for the evening. Dr. Kate Ahmad is a Sydney neurologist and advocate for the environment and social justice. Now, tonight she'll be talking about the health implications of COVID, both physical and mental health effects of lockdown, COVID mitigation, and all the ways we are trying to tackle COVID. So that's the initial response. Then she's going to look at how we can live with COVID and prepare for and prevent the next possible pandemic. Dr. Kate Ahmad, thanks for joining us. I'll let you take it over now.
Thanks, Lish. So as Lish mentioned, I'm going to talk about the health effects of living with COVID. So the effects if you get infected, the effects of infection in the longer term, the effects of social isolation during COVID containment strategies, and what we can do to survive this pandemic and how do we avoid this from happening again. So most of us in Australia haven't had a COVID infection yet, thankfully, but what should we expect if we get infected? So for most of us, especially for those without too many birthdays, we're likely just to get a fever, maybe a cough, some fatigue, and we'll probably be sick for just a couple of weeks. But for some of us, maybe about a fifth of us, we might actually get sicker than this. So we might develop difficulty breathing due to COVID pneumonia. Some of us might need oxygen in a hospital environment. For about 5% of people, an ICU stay is necessary, and this can include mechanical ventilation to get air into the lungs and support for other potentially failing organ systems, including the kidneys, the brain. And some patients will require several weeks on ventilators, and some unfortunately will not survive. So death with COVID is unlike other deaths. It's not the death that we are all aiming and hoping for. It's often a really lonely death. So friends and family are often not allowed to visit, and if they can, there's often very strict restrictions on who can come and how long they can stay. Many families have actually had to say goodbye via a video link. And I've got a painting that I wanted to show you. So this is by Spanish painter Juan Lucena, who captured this heartbreaking situation, really showing a whole generation of grandparents who've had to leave without saying goodbye to their grandchildren. So about 1% of people infected with COVID eventually die, though this figure's been constantly adjusted and it varies from place to place. If you're young, then the risk of death is very low, though it's not zero. If you're over 80, then you might have about a 1 in 5 or 6 chance of dying if you contract the virus, which is pretty scary. Then if you do survive, as most people do, we are seeing a little bit more trouble coming out after. So reports are emerging that if you survive COVID, especially if you require hospitalisation, you might end up with chronic lung scarring, heart damage, and lots of other persistent symptoms such as fatigue and mood disorders. And there are even concerns that it might increase your risk of developing a neurodegenerative disease later in life, like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. So there could be quite long-standing effects. So generally, we don't want to be infected with COVID if we can avoid it. And it's much, much more than a cold, and it's much more than just the seasonal flu that we see each year. And this is why our government's implemented so many social distancing and lockdown measures. So we might talk about these now. There's a wide variety across Australia in type and severity of lockdown measures, but they do share some characteristics. So we're all being asked to stay further away from each other, to refrain from large gatherings, to work from home if possible, to not travel. For some of us, I think myself included, this has been annoying, but it's not been catastrophic. I've got a secure job, I've got a comfortable home to spend time in, I feel safe at home, and I have access to healthcare. But not everyone is so lucky. And as Sharon alluded to, COVID's really widened the inequality gap in a way that we perhaps didn't anticipate. So if we start with jobs, about 2.3 million people, or 1 in 5 working adults, have become unemployed or had their working hours reduced since March. So this has resulted in financial insecurity as well as a loss of routine and purpose for many people. And we know that unemployment alone increases the relative risk of suicide by 2 to 3-fold. So in the midst of a health emergency with no defined end, this is a really big concern. Then what if your home isn't a safe place to be locked down in or to spend time working or homeschooling? 1 in 10 Australian women in a relationship have actually experienced domestic violence during the COVID crisis, and 2/3 of them say the attack started or worsened during this time. And similar statistics have emerged from around the world. So domestic violence at its worst may lead to homicide, but even when it doesn't, it directly contributes to suicide, severe mental and physical health issues, as well as financial and housing insecurity for women. So most psychiatrists that I talk to are also reporting a large spike in mental health distress due to social isolation. People are very anxious about a global pandemic in general, and they've had often a big change in their status and routine. In Victoria, rates of mental illness in children have doubled. This is new research that's come out recently. And the University of Sydney actually predicts a 13.7% increased risk of suicide in the coming years, attributable to the pandemic and its effects. And then there are a whole lot of restrictions with currently unmeasurable health effects. So the loss of sporting activities that we're seeing, loss of physical activity and perhaps increased caloric intake with working from home, loss of major life milestones such as formals, graduations, loss of the ability to grieve together with only very small funerals allowed. And the health effects of some of these restrictions may not be fully realised for years. So if we're in a situation when both catching COVID and avoiding it comes with significant problems, then how do we move forward? I think the obvious answer here is a vaccine. If we vaccinate most people and get a degree of safe herd immunity, we could potentially keep community spread to a minimum. However, several problems obviously remain. So as of today, a safe and effective vaccine is not available. And though we've got the world's best minds working on it, these things take time. And these researchers are performing the Herculean feat of a vaccine against a coronavirus, which has actually never yet been done. And then if a vaccine does become available, it may not last forever. It may only last for 6 to 12 months. We might need yearly dosing. It might not offer complete protection. Many vaccines reduce the risk of contracting an illness, but don't necessarily eliminate it. So while we wait for this vaccine, imperfect though it may be, what else can we do? I think we should look at options that provide protection at low personal cost. So wearing a mask is really easy. You can still have your personal freedoms, but it just means that you're less likely to contract the virus and less likely to pass it on. I recommend using a reusable one outside of healthcare situations so we don't further destroy the planet. Same with hand hygiene. It's really easy. You can do it. It doesn't cost you anything, and it allows you to move around a bit more freely. I think it's really important that you look after the rest of your health, as it's going to increase your odds of survival if you do get infected. Manage your cardiovascular risk factors, in particular. Stop smoking, treat high blood pressure, optimize your diabetes. Don't avoid your doctor because you're worried about catching COVID. You're more likely to have your chronic health problems actually worsen than to catch the infection at the moment. And then I think we should all live as largely as possible within the restrictions that we have. So I think we need to get outside every day. Sunlight's good for us. It improves health and mood. It's really rare to catch COVID outside, so it's probably the safest place to be. I think we should travel within our local area or state if we can, depending on the government restrictions. In Australia, this still gives you a pretty good holiday and it's really good for your mental health. It's also supporting local small businesses. And I think we can do this in other ways too, like buying takeaway meals if we can't go out to our restaurants that we used to like to go to, using online shopping to support local businesses rather than going to large shopping malls where we're also more likely to be infected. And then I think we all have to sort of have a mindset shift in that we have to try and gain learning experiences from what we've had to change. So look at us tonight, we're having a Zoom meeting. And I think for work, this has actually freed many of us up from long and really unnecessary commutes going somewhere together when we could have done it all virtually. And then working from home at least some of the time is really positive for many families. And again, reduces unnecessary cars on the road and carbon emissions. I think from the medical perspective, we can attend international conferences from our bedroom these days. We don't have to have a 2-week holiday overseas to actually go and meet with our colleagues, which I think is really great, especially if you're a parent or it's a little bit difficult to get that time off. It's also likely that carbon emissions will be down by about 7% this year. And maybe this global pandemic is the disruption that we need to finally address climate change properly. And just in that vein, I think we've all become a bit more acquainted with the simple pleasures of life. So we like cooking our own bread. Everyone's a sourdough chef these days. Bushwalking in our local area, having days at home with family, things that we might not have had time for before this all began. Then preparing for the future, I think as difficult as it may be to face, COVID may not be the most destructive pandemic that we face in our lifetimes. So outbreaks of infectious diseases are actually increasing, and most of these are zoonotic diseases, which means they spill over from animals to humans. And in particular, there is ongoing concern about novel influenza strains with pandemic potential. So if one of the more deadly avian influenza strains, such as H5N1, gains the ability to transmit from human to human, then we could be in really big trouble because some of these novel influenza strains have mortality rates of about 40%, so much more dangerous than COVID. So I think we all can contribute to reduce the risk of another pandemic by understanding where most novel influenza or coronaviruses emerge from. So they're both zoonotic diseases, they come from animals, and they're able to spread and propagate because of our unhealthy relationship with animals. So intensive chicken and pig farms are the source of nearly all novel influenza outbreaks, and recent avian influenza human cases have been acquired from chickens being bred for food. So wet markets, which we've seen a lot of talk about with coronavirus, are where many different wild animals are close together, very stressed animals, very prone to becoming ill. And again, they're treated unnaturally. And wet markets have been the source of the SARS epidemic, and it's likely to be the source of the COVID-19 epidemic. So when you look at these animals that are trying to inhabit landscapes that have been altered and destroyed by land clearing and deforestation, they've been found to be more likely to carry pathogens, which are viruses and bacteria, which can affect humans. So if we are serious about preventing and not just living with pandemics, we really need to re-examine our relationship with animals and the terrible way in which we treat them. So you can see on the screen, this is an intensive chicken farm. And it's been said that if you want to create a pandemic, then you should set up an intensive farm because you've got often millions of animals moving through a single space in a year with a very quick turnover. You've got feces everywhere, you've got sick birds, and you can see how quickly an infection can propagate in this kind of environment. So I think what I'm trying to say is that our appetite for cheap meat might actually lead to the next global catastrophe, which is terrifying. So for now, living with COVID is about adjusting to change, developing new routines and habits. It's about grasping at the positives, even when the negatives might seem a bit overwhelming. It's about trusting healthcare professionals and not succumbing to some of the conspiracy theories that are going around. I think it's about working together as a community to protect the vulnerable now and to take measures to prevent any further pandemics. Thank you.
Dr. Kate Ahmad, thank you so much for running us through that. I think often in the discussion around COVID, we forget this is a health crisis, primarily, like initially a health crisis, and then the knock-on of the social effects and the economic effects. But to frame it in that way, I think we have forgotten all those effects. But thank you for reframing some of them to point out what some of the good we have gotten out of it is. Like that is the true silver lining. While we've had to scratch pretty hard, haven't we, to find that. Next up, we have Mirko Milic. He's from Canberra Toyota. This is a focus on the business effect, or the effect on business that COVID has had all around the world. Here in Canberra, it's no less than anywhere else. Mirko is the dealer principal of Canberra Toyota. He's the chief operating officer of General Automotive Group, which employ around 400 people here in Canberra. He's going to talk about just the effect on business and the automotive industry, the effect on employees, of course, the next phase, and eventual recovery. Thanks so much, Mirko.
Thanks, Lish, and good evening, everybody. Glad to be here with you all tonight. So, business and living with COVID-19. I realise that every business has been affected differently here in Canberra and across the country. So I'm going to touch on the automotive industry, how it's affected us here in Canberra, and then sort of give you more of a macro view of the automotive industry in Australia and what's been happening there and all the risk mitigation processes that have gone on and how we're looking to get out of this crisis over the next period of time. So in the beginning, when COVID-19 first arrived, we had to do a massive risk assessment, think on our feet, so to speak, because we're very much a frontline customer interactive business. So buying cars is very interactive. Getting vehicles serviced and repaired is very interactive, and simply buying parts for a car requires most of our customers to have some sort of contact with our employees and various parts of the business. So in the beginning, we had to sort of work out a way how we were going to mitigate some of the risks. You know, we're in Canberra, we're situated in many different locations around the place, and we have a lot of staff that cross over. So we had to identify those risks and those staff members and try and reduce the number of contact we had in between branches. So in the event of one dealership perhaps becoming infected or getting an infection that could quickly spread, we would have the other dealerships around Canberra that could still be operating and functioning as normal as possible. So there were some of the thought process that were going on back in March, April, when the pandemic hit us pretty hard. The car industry in general has been doing it tough for many years because we're a high volume, low margin business. So any sort of contraction in sales has a dramatic effect on all of us. And as you've mentioned, we've got 400 employees and a family base, 4 or 5 times more than that we need to look after. So, we've had to try and keep going as best we can, selling cars wherever possible, servicing vehicles, repairing vehicles, particularly for essential services, and we've done that across all of our sites in Canberra. As a industry, the car industry employs about 55,000 people in Australia. The extension of that is when you include all the other suppliers, all the other companies, businesses that are associated with the car industry, such as mechanical workshops and panel repairers, part suppliers, aftermarket suppliers. That workforce stretches to about 300,000 people. There's a lot of people that's affected by what's going on with the pandemic. Currently in Victoria, our dealerships are closed and there's not much activity there, and they're sort of working out what they can do during a stage 4 restriction and what the plans are going to be when those restrictions finally ease. But as an industry, we're a massive contributor to the country's economy. As a responsible corporate citizen, we donate approximately $15 million a year to different community groups, sporting groups. So that's all being diminished during this pandemic. And our next speaker is going to be a charity that we also support here in Canberra, and obviously they're affected by our inability to support them like we normally do. As far as other risks and challenges, obviously in Canberra, the infection rate's been low, so we're very blessed with that. We're lucky that that's been the case, and we've been able to keep all our businesses going and open. We've modified some of our processes, which I'll touch on in a minute when we talk about opportunities. And we've been going okay. The government has also helped. I can't deny that. The JobKeeper payments have saved many jobs here in our group and tens of thousands across Australia in all other dealerships. So that's been fantastic. Same with the instant asset write-off stimulus package. That's proven to be quite solid, particularly in June, when most businesses are gearing up to buy some new equipment, buy some new cars. And another opportunity exists with that as we try and trade out of this pandemic as well, which I'll touch on in a minute. But the government can help even further. Our industry has been plagued with many unnecessary taxes and duties for many years. A lot of them were initially introduced to protect the local manufacturing industry. That's not here anymore. We don't make cars anymore in Australia, so some of those taxes are invalid, and the government can help. An opportunity for the government is to reduce some of those taxes, like luxury car tax, for example, maybe abolish those remaining import tariffs with those countries that don't have a free trade agreement with Australia, which will reduce the price of cars. And they could also, offer stimulus packages for companies with big fleets. So they renew their vehicles and they buy safer, low emission vehicles rather than hanging on to those cars that are sometimes 20 years or more older, and are usually the cars that are involved in most accidents around the country. So that sort of stimulus package from the government would be well received by us, and would go a long way in restoring the losses that we've made. When I want to talk about losses, this year alone, we've dropped about 20% in sales compared to last year. I did mention the industry's been receding now for about 2.5 years, and obviously the drought, fire, hail, and COVID has also impacted on that big time. So we're down 20%. Our friends in Victoria are down 60%. So recovery like that's going to take a long time, and if the government can help with those little stimulus packages and abolitions of taxes, it'd be well received for sure. What can we do as a dealership group in Canberra? Well, we want to try and stay as positive as we can. We want to embrace digitisation, where you can buy a car from any of our dealerships without actually visiting. You can have your car picked up and dropped off for a service without having to come to the dealership. We can facilitate all those payments for any of those transactions online quite easily. The world's not quite there yet when it comes to contactless purchasing of vehicles. It's a bit like buying a house. It's a big investment, and it's hard to do that where you don't touch, feel, or test drive the asset. but we're getting there, and I think the future is going to be all about that. We're certainly learning more and more about that as we struggle through this pandemic, and we're embracing this digitalisation of our industry in a big way. We're embracing technology in general. I mean, the car industry is changing so much that Toyota themselves are now calling themselves a mobility company rather than a car company. So they're getting ready for the future, and we need to as well. So we've got to keep up the hygiene factors. We've got to keep sanitising all our cars and all of our assets around the dealerships. We're going to be offering different ways of transacting with us. We're going to encourage people to buy cars, because if you can't go overseas, you can still go down the coast for a holiday or go to Sydney for a drive, and some of our cars are perfect for that. There's some new models coming through. The technology is improving dramatically. Hybrid cars are fantastic, with lower emissions, savings in fuel consumption in general, and just better cars in general. And the future, with full electric cars is coming as well. So our industry has gone through a lot of change. We've had to think on our feet during this pandemic and do what we had to do to survive. And we look forward to coming out of this, and it's encouraging to see some of the other automotive industries, such as China, for example, where it's sort of going back to some sort of normality, 70% normality. They're the biggest car manufacturer and seller in the world now. It's 28 million new cars a year or something back before the pandemic. We're a million. So, it's good to see them coming back around. I'm hoping that, after a few months, we're sort of seeing some light at the end of the tunnel for sure. But I thought I'd give you a bit of an overview of the automotive industry and what we're doing in Canberra. So thank you very much.
Mirko, thank you so much for pointing out all those elements that I had never even considered of business, but also pinpointing it to the automotive industry. Certainly, I'd never even thought about how we might be able to help by driving more, because we're flying less. See, I love a sales pitch at the end too. Thank you. If anyone has a question for any of our previous three speakers, Kate, Mirko or Sharon, please write them down in the Q&A little bubbles down the bottom. I see a few of you have already written questions there, which is fabulous, and excellent questions as well. So we will put those to the speakers after our next and final presentation this evening. I think we're doing very well for time. I feel like I need to offer you all a bathroom break or anything, but I think we'll push on. Is everybody okay? And now, our final speaker for this evening is Barnie Van Wyk. He is the CEO of St Vincent de Paul Society here in Canberra and Goulburn. Now, he brings with him a lot of experience on international boards and strategic experience and governance and change management. But essentially here on the ground, he is dealing with the fallout of COVID, the social fallout, and as a charity, how he can keep providing while they themselves are struggling, as you just heard from Mirko, the knock-on effects of business not being able to be supported and generally just people not being able to give as much as they could have, yet the demand is higher and higher. He's going to touch on social isolation, reduced job security, loss of community that comes with the pandemic, and of course the lack of volunteers that we rely on so much, just not who we rely on, but the volunteers rely on it as part of their social connectedness as well. So thank you so much, Barnie.
Thank you, Lish, and thank you everybody for forming part of this occasion tonight. I also want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the land on which we meet, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Folks, I think that much of what I will say tonight, you would have heard in some shape or form. I will try and just bring a little bit of a practical social impact as we've experienced that from a Viennese perspective. Especially during the first wave, etc. It was clearly visible to us that that people were struggling as they managed the peaks and troughs of their own anxiety. And I think all of us have experienced that in some form, whether it was through our employees, but also through the people that's vulnerable that we've all mentioned here, and Kate and Sharon particularly mentioned. And we have seen that pretty clearly from a Viennese perspective, that was certainly that unknown, that, what does this really mean? Especially if you talk about people, with high and complex needs who have no understanding of what was happening around them. They could see that there were businesses closing and not open. So what does it mean for me if I don't really understand what's happening around me? So what we've done is we've retained contact with vulnerable Canberrans. And with some, with the outreach services and face-to-face contact, mostly reduced to electronic contact where possible. Now, the other problem that we have that I think is very much important to understand here, and is specifically from an organization who is very much reliant on providers, is that when the ACT Health or health departments were putting out information and guidelines about what should happen and what which businesses could remain open or not, we were faced with quite a number of the providers shutting down that we relied on to be able to provide services to the most vulnerable people in our community. So what has happened in the Viennese environment, and here I need to give a great plug to my team. We all pulled together and we started to become really innovative in terms of providing support, providing food and for our vulnerable Canberrans. Now, the other problem that we have that I think is also mentioned to you here is that, we were talking about digitization and electronic engagement and things like that, which I listened to. And one of the things that we've experienced here is, especially with the vulnerable older Canberrans, that's been a bit of a problem because they didn't have the technology. Now think about that. You all, saw on television, the shops were all closed, the streets are empty, etc. And here you have a vulnerable person, a rough sleeper, walking around with no technology. They're older, they don't have access to it, etc. So, it's that type of effect that I think that's important. But I also want to reflect on the opportunities here. Is that, where people are stood down or have lost their jobs, I think that what we've seen here is that many people came forward from a volunteering perspective. It is, I think it's an important thing, especially, if you talk about, a continuation of a routine and a connectedness with others, etc. We were all talking about the social isolation that has been experienced here. So I think that that's important to understand that, those who could volunteer, as Kate mentioned, who were not part of the risk categories, etc., that was an opportunity. So what did we do? In the ACT, we've actually kept our Viennese centres open. And not all of them were closed. So we've closed quite a number, but we've also kept some open to be able to provide that frontline service to some of our vulnerable people that did not have the access to some support and services. So for us, I think that the opportunity that we have is to consider where possible and where we have the health, etc., that service or servant leadership, if you wish. It's a core value that we have within our society, and I think it's highly recognized by employers, and the ability to reflect a choice of service in the face of hardship, in future years if you apply for a position, etc. So I think that whilst we're talking about some of the harder aspects here, it's also important to reflect that there are some other aspects that we need to focus on that we could potentially use as an opportunity going forward. I do want to touch on some of the behaviours. I won't talk about all of it because I think some of the things like domestic violence have already been covered, so I won't cover that. But I think it's important to reflect on the homelessness. Now, it's a visible manifestation of inequality in our society. And here in the ACT, there are approximately 80 rough sleepers, some with significant mental health concerns that we work with. And my team from a street to home perspective are very much involved in that space. So we've been able to house another 30 people in 3 months through the Axial Housing Initiative, which is an initiative between government providing housing, our Vinnie Street to Home program, working with the people experiencing high and complex needs, and also to provide and enroll them with Catholic Care to provide wraparound services. And why I'm mentioning that to you is that is one of the biggest positives that came out of COVID here in the ACT, and that is that you have so many people in the community sector and government all working together in a very short space of time, looking after people whom for years we have not been able to house, and we could provide them a home, a place where they could reside, and where there could be some services that we could provide for them to assist them. So I think it's an important aspect to understand why that was such a huge success. Because during the closure that we had of various businesses, etc., we also had the closure of public spaces. So many of our rough sleepers and people that's homeless, they didn't have any place to go. Think about that. Many of them do not have internet access or a computer. They normally would go to a library to use that. All libraries were closed. You talk about the parks, and we talk about, Kate mentioned that you have to get out and do some exercise. We had a situation here where the parks were closed, and many of our companions that's sleeping rough, they frequent the parks, and that's where they live. So that has been a bit of a problem for us. So keeping the Vinnie shops open were very much an important thing for us. And we literally had people wandering around the Vinnie shops for hours because there was nowhere else that they could go. So I think that what I'd like to see as an opportunity here for us is that there are so many positives that we need to consider in terms of our partnership arrangements. We sometimes think silo-based. We think about what is the solution that I can provide. But what we have here is we have a strong opportunity to break down the silos, to think more laterally about, what is the support that we can provide as a group, as a partnership that we can put out there. Because I think that if we work together, there's certainly an opportunity for us. The other opportunity that I think is very important is and I'll reflect on this as part of domestic violence, and that is to stay connected. Stay connected and stay healthy, as Kate has mentioned and Sharon's mentioned. Stay focused on positive messages, as Mirko has mentioned. And, where necessary, I believe, start something that you've never had time for in the past. It's an opportunity. It's something that you can build on. I'd like to now reflect just on the job security situation. Now, clearly, from a Vinnie's perspective, economic instability, downturn, and combined with an inability to host physical events, that even from a shop perspective, that where the money that we use to look after people leads to fewer donations and obviously a lower dollar value. So we're in exactly the same position that Mirko has mentioned. So if we consider the other aspect of it is that we're in a recession officially now. So, during a recession, wages stop growing, and we've seen a 7% shrink in the Australian economy. And there's approximately 30,000 people in the ACT living below the poverty line. So let's just think about that. How many is 30,000 people? If you've been to the GIO Stadium here in Canberra, you think about that stadium filled to capacity, then we have more people in poverty than we can fit into the GIO Stadium. Now, what is the poverty line? The poverty line is measured at $433 a week for a single adult to live on. So there are more than 30,000 people in that space. So that was before COVID. So going back to what Sharon has mentioned, there's some real big concerns here. In July, for instance, there were over 14,800 people receiving DSS unemployment payments in the ACT, and that's job seeker or youth allowance and any other payments. Now, let's position that. That is a 126% increase since December. The national increase was 99%. So we often talk about the ACT being, the best place to live and the most affluent and etc. and median income wise. But think about that. So in the ACT, we also have a different situation, and that's in terms of our housing shortfall. We have a housing shortfall here of 3,000 properties if you consider the 2016 ABS data. So that was before COVID-19 and the last summer bushfires. So the concerns that we have is that after the reduction of JobKeeper by $300, as it was announced by the Treasurer, and that will go down from $1,500 to $1,200 and around the 4th of January to $1,000. We will have, and in the ACT, approximately 15,000 Canberrans that will be affected. And that will create a loss in the ACT's economy of $3.4 million per week. So it is significant if you consider that, and the impact has a flow-on impact in terms of job creation, etc. So for me, there's just an added aspect here that we experience. We have seen a reduction during JobKeeper of 42% of people experiencing emergency material and financial aid. And what we are now preparing ourselves for is at the end of September, towards October, when all of the changes will come about, that we will see many more people coming back and more people that will now fall into poverty and that would require our support. Specifically, if we talk about the older cohort. So, if you give you a practical example, the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence published a report in June 2020 highlighting that up to 30% of the newly unemployed, underemployed people, were between 51 and 65. Now, the per capita report, Measure for Measure, in turn highlights the disadvantage of women from a social and economic well-being perspective compared to men. So there are many aspects here that we have to consider. It's not just the fact that there's not sufficient income. There are certain categories of people that we're really concerned about and that we need to consider. So what is the opportunity here? Now, Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe and on the 14th of August says there is, and I quote, "I think a fairly broad consensus across society that some increase in the level of the old New Start is appropriate." And I would join that consensus. Now, there are many more that's come out in exactly the same space. Now, from a Vinnie's perspective, we've also been advocating for housing as a basic human right. Because if we have somebody in a home and we have that focus on affordable housing, we've all seen the Anglicare report about there's no affordable housing here in the ACT for somebody that is on the New Start or job seeker. So those are all areas that we need to focus on. We need to really look at the advocacy from a basic human right perspective. We also need to consider from a social housing acceleration and renovation program perspective that was released in May 2020. Now, the details about how building 30,000 social homes over the next 4 years will create up to 18,000 jobs. So we need to, again, as I said in the partnership arrangement, need to consider specifically the construction component that will provide the support. I also believe it is extremely important, as I've mentioned to you, we've seen the reduction of the 42% of people requiring support after, they've received the increased job seeker payment. I think that there's a strong message here that we need to raise the rate of New Start. We need to look after people because we've seen them standing on their own 2 feet. We have seen them being able to stand there and have dignity. Because that's one of the things that we see that seriously impact on people is that they can't pay and they're being sent from pillar to post to be able to secure some support. And that dignity is all lost. And we need to support and advocate strongly for Raise the Rate campaign. So in terms of the community, the last part that I'd like to focus on tonight are the key issues for Australia, and may I single out here the continuing poor treatment of asylum seekers, which has been exacerbated by the Commonwealth's refusal to help over 1 million people on temporary visas, including thousands of asylum seekers who've been made destitute by COVID. And that is a significant impact. Vinnies have been very much involved, along with many other organisations, in helping, but it's difficult. It's difficult to assist and to provide that support. Now, I think that what we find here in the ACT government, and I need to applaud them, is that we have particularly good support here, but that is not the case with many of the other states and territories. And this support has enabled Companion House and Canberra Refugee Support and Vinnies to increase our common efforts to support destitute asylum seekers here in the ACT. The other part in community that I need to mention is the services that were reduced from 4 or more volunteers to just 2 per shift in some of our key services, like home visitation, that has been affected here in the delivery of hampers, etc., and the hampers being dropped off at the door and not being taken inside, etc. And that obviously compounds the whole matter of social isolation. But I think that the valuable aspect that we have here is that there's the services still in the community of engagement, and there are volunteers that's not falling in the risk category that certainly can engage. What are the opportunities then for us? The opportunities are such as our night patrol van here. And Mirko will tell you all about that. We are obviously huge supporters of Canberra Toyota, and Mirko has donated the 2nd night patrol van for Canberra Toyota, and his team is so involved in all of that. But it's important for us to look at how families, how teams, etc., can engage in those services, and how we can provide that social connection that is needed for our most vulnerable Canberrans out there that's sleeping rough, or that's homeless, who are experiencing domestic violence, etc., and be that first level of connection and a referral for them. So it's important that I want to reiterate that we need to look at our neighborhood, and our participation at neighborhood level is critical, especially when times are tough. Sharon has mentioned all about that, and you could actually plug every single thing that I've mentioned so far in that picture that she's had there. And what we need to understand is that within the boundaries of COVID-19 and ACT health guidelines and restrictions, etc., we need to empower people. And I absolutely endorse and echo the traveling, and to have that ability to engage socially at such a different level on a daily basis, and just to break your everyday experiences. It's so important to see that. And I'd like to mention to you something that I've seen during COVID-19, which is a picture that I will never forget. I saw a young man in the neighborhood where I live, and he was, during COVID-19, walking, and I believe that must have been some of his exercise. But what he was doing was he was picking up rubbish as part of his daily exercise. And I saw him a couple of times. Where he's walking and he's picking up something. And I thought to myself, what a wonderful, beautiful act that is to say, well, it's not just about the exercise, it's about making a contribution to the community. And I think that's what we need to take away here. We need to ask ourselves, how can I make a difference to the community given everything that I have here, given everything that is happening? How can I can I have and include younger people? How can I get younger volunteers into my business, bring that wealth of knowledge, ideas, enthusiasm, creativity, and everything that they have? How can we bring that into a situation that we're currently experiencing so that we can just build on that? No, I almost want to say post-COVID, or in the process, in this journey that we have as we break through this whole COVID initiative. I think I'll stop there because I've already used way more than the time that I'm allocated. Thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you so much, Barney. I'm sorry to have to keep on sort of waving in the corner here. I'm not quite sure of the protocol on how to say. Fabulous, though. Thank you so much for bringing, each one of you for bringing your perspectives. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Kate and Sharon, Barney and Mirko. But now we have some questions from you on the Q&A. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking part and being so engaged. What a wonderful evening. Thank you for all of your input. First question is, I feel, does anyone need to get up and stretch or anything? I feel it's got to do a bit of that. First question is from Valerie for you, Kate. Valerie asks, could you please elaborate a little more on the research into the increased mental health issues of children living, say, in Melbourne in particular? Valerie has asked, but just in general as well. Thanks.
Well, there's actually been a recent study which came out, I think, about a week ago, and it was a big study. I think they looked at about 3 million GP visits, and they looked at diagnoses, and they compared it to what was happening last year. And what they found was that depression and anxiety and eating disorder rates had all increased in children. Interestingly, eczema had increased as well, and they're wondering if that's due to being inside and locked down. And some of the things that we normally see, like flu and contagious gastroenteritis, had almost disappeared. So I think this is initial sort of data, and we'll probably see more of the effects coming later, because my understanding is that at this point the suicide rate has not increased or hasn't been measurably increased. But this is a bit of a worry that these mental health disorders in young people do seem to have significantly increased during the COVID period.
Another text. I feel like I've got talkback callers. Another message from someone asking, probably for you, Kate, as well, any update on the bird flu outbreak in Victoria, just with relation to the intensive animal farming and the follow-on from that. Have you got any detail on that?
I did not know there was a bird flu outbreak in Victoria, actually.
I think there's, I'm just wondering, there was some media around an avian. Anyway, we'll leave that one there if anyone.
Sorry.
No, not at all. Syed asks, what is hard to understand that despite knowing COVID has horrible consequences, including personal, financial and liberty, why aren't we rolling out technological solutions, including incentives to businesses and employers to eliminate viruses at workplaces through using, I think this one says, fogging with hypochlorous at entry points, surface fogging and air fogging frequently as appropriate technologies are available. I guess, is that a way of managing? Is anyone familiar with those techniques that might be able to answer that question? Mirko, Barney, no. Sharon, no. It sounds like if Syed, if you could expand on that question, it sounds like a way of tackling the virus through a type of killing it at entry points, a bit like a sanitisation method, deep cleaning. Am I right, Syed, if you're still there? We'll move on to another question. Thanks. This is from Jeev. Mr. Ali, thanks for an excellent forum. My comment for the panel, especially Professor Bessell and Dr. Ahmad, who touched on the prospect of our learning and changing behaviour post-COVID. Rebecca Solnit recently published in The Guardian on what coronavirus can teach us about hope, an article that left more questions than answers. Shall we expect some significant policy changes post-COVID? Shall we expect some real and lasting behaviour changes post-COVID? Who would like to answer that? I think, Sharon, I might put it to you first. You did touch on it initially, but should we expect some significant policy changes post-COVID in terms of hope and actually delivering?
Thanks, Lish, and thanks, I think, G, for the question. I think when we first went into the COVID crisis and the lockdowns began, there was a sense that, amongst some at least, that this could be a turning point, that this could be an opportunity for us to rethink the types of societies or the types of society that we have and that we want to be. And I think understandably, some of the responses have been very much around, let's get back to the normal. We hear this term new normal, but no one knows what new normal really means. But there is a sense of how do we kind of get back to where we were? And I think if we see this only as getting back to where we were, then we're not going to take the opportunity or the hope that maybe we have at the moment. Now, I don't want to overstate the hope and the optimism, because we've heard from Mirko, we've heard from Barnie and from Kate, you know, just how much people are struggling with this situation. But there is an almost unprecedented opportunity because of this situation for us to rethink what our societies might be. And I think at a very real level, whether we can hope for change, whether we can hope for lasting behavioural changes and different attitudes, really depends on what we make it. We certainly need leadership around that, but we also need to have conversations within societies about what it is that we want from our communities going forward. And I'm not sure that is just going back to what we had before. You know, Barney's touched a lot on some of the issues around social inequalities and injustice, and we see things that have come out of COVID, as Barney spoke about addressing homelessness in the short term, about finding places for people who have been rough sleeping to be during COVID-19. Now, initiatives like those are initiatives that we have to grab hold of and say we will not allow our society to go back to seeing people sleeping on the streets, to seeing people sleeping rough. And so I think whether there's hope depends on whether we want to create the hope and hang on to it.
And Dr. Ahmad, you mentioned just the environmental change in terms of real and lasting behavioural changes post-COVID. You mentioned not having to go to a conference, for example, overseas and be away from your family for 2 weeks. Do you see that changing? Because I know, Mirko, as well, you mentioned just people getting on the road more rather than getting in the air, and how that can bring back part of that huge loss to the business that you've seen. Do you see it lasting? This is the thing, because how many of us, I guess, went straight back to our routine as soon as restrictions were lessened, lightened in the ACT, how quickly we started to fill our calendar again, having praised how lovely it was just to have a moment's breather to see it empty a little bit. I'd like your thoughts on that, perhaps Kate and then Mirko.
I don't think things will go back to exactly what they were. If you think about, say, international travel, where most of us, or many of us, would leave Australia every year, sometimes multiple times, I think we're going to see more expensive flights. I think we're going to see people that are a little bit more frightened to sit in a metal tube with hundreds of other people for hours on end. And then potentially, like, we've seen things like getting stuck in other countries and not being able to get home, things that we never had to consider for. So I expect and probably hope that we do see a reduction in air travel, given that it's one of the biggest contributors to carbon emissions. But I think it's like what Sharon said, we have to grasp the opportunities, because if we don't, then I think this is really a lost opportunity. This is the only time in my life, and probably in everyone's life, that the whole world has come together and basically stopped and also addressed a problem together. So we haven't seen conflict between countries, particularly when it comes to dealing with the COVID pandemic. No one's coming up to us and saying, hang on, why aren't you letting our people into your country? Everyone's got a common goal. And I think that's hope in itself, in that when a true crisis comes, that countries can actually stop and they can do things very quickly, and they can actually address a problem at the sort of whole societal level. So, I mean, there is hope there, but I am worried that people do just want to go back to the new normal, rather than using this as an opportunity for green energy, for addressing social inequality. Like, if we can house homeless people during COVID, then why can't we house them all the time, for example? So there are lots of opportunities, but yeah, I think time will tell whether or not we actually take advantage of them.
And Mirko, you mentioned just the hybrid cars, and certainly we saw a pitch on the ACT government asking for 1,000 new electric vehicles for the ACT. Do you see that changing now with the future, or that technology isn't focused on that in that direction following this?
Yeah, thanks, Lish. Look, that technology is coming regardless of the pandemic or not. I think the world's changing completely when it comes to that mobility method. I think electric cars and autonomous cars and all those things that we see concepts of will definitely arrive. So it's coming regardless. But I think, the opportunities for us are fairly good because, we are an island. And if we can eradicate the disease on this island, open up borders between states, and there's a lot to see and explore. I mean, sure, we can't go overseas, we can't do our trips to Europe like we do every year, but I've got lots of friends now that are buying motorhomes for the first time and dusting off their surfboards to go and visit different parts of Australia that they may not have been to before or haven't been there for a long time. So that's an opportunity. So if we embrace what we can do domestically and wait it out, we'll eventually get back overseas. But to get to all those different areas of our big island, we definitely need cars.
Absolutely. From Imran Ahmad, hi, Dr. Ahmad. Thanks, Lish panelists. A great session. He says costs a massive. Oh, sorry. Here we go. Sorry. Getting to it. Oh, I think it's just disappeared. Let me find it. Sorry, Ahmad. Sharon, you greatly captured the poverty and inequality in Australia. I feel the issue of poverty and inequality is not fully captured at the political level, notwithstanding the nuances and efforts that are happening. COVID-19 has now exacerbated the conditions under which inequalities will rise. How do we deal with this, given the inequalities at the policy and political level, to deal with the issues at a comprehensive level? I wonder, perhaps Sharon or Barney might be able to answer that one. How do we deal? Barney, would you like to tackle that one quickly?
So I think from our perspective, that's one of the biggest reasons for our advocacy, because we believe that we can certainly do something about that. There are some really antiquated methods of dealing with a number of issues, and I think that we've got a call to action, and we need to heed that call. It is if we don't do it, we are doing ourselves a great injustice for the future, because I reflect on the past conversation of this, we're not going to go back to where we were. Things are totally changing. And it's about how are we going to deal with this inequality? How are we going to deal with diversity in terms of income? If I've mentioned to you, specifically if we talk about older women older than 55 and that inequality that you have in terms of income, how are we going to be able to look after them if they don't have that level of support? So these are things that we definitely need to tackle, and we definitely need to consider policy. We definitely need to look at the asylum seekers and the situation that we have from that perspective. It is a definitive matter to look after housing, and housing is a basic human right. We have to consider all of that.
Sharon, do you think the government will tackle it at a political level?
I'm not sure that the government will tackle it, but I think we do need to tackle it. And I think there are some really interesting debates going on, and also policy initiatives happening around the world that we can look to. So there's been a lot of debate globally around a universal basic income. Now, whether that's something that's appropriate for Australia or not, I think is a discussion to be had. But that's the concept of people receiving a minimum living wage, and a minimum living wage or a basic income that ensures that care work that's not paid for through one's employment is actually valued within society and compensated. So that's a really radical idea, and it requires complete restructuring of an economy. but it's an idea that we can start to think about, that we can grapple with. We see in Scotland, in Iceland, in a number of countries, a shift towards a well-being economy. So we're not only focused on economic growth and on increasing GDP, but we're focused on increasing a whole range of indicators that mean we consider emissions, we consider people's mental health, we consider social connectedness. And again, it's a radical idea that takes significant political and economic restructuring, but this is actually starting to happen in some places around the world. So we've got models to look to, but we need the political will and I think the political courage to say it's time to look at some of these very different ways of thinking about our societies.
Couple of updates on questions we asked earlier around the bird flu. Yes, there was a bird flu outbreak in Victoria on a free-range egg farm, just if anyone's interested. And there was a risk there. It doesn't seem to say how it's managed now, but thank you, Valerie, for following up on that. And another question from PJ Williams, saying, not a question as such, but interested in the panel's answers. Should JobSeeker or New Start transition to a living wage payment that guarantees a minimum income, which is what you were just talking about there, Sharon? Is there another way of doing the universal basic income that might be more palatable for Australia and the government?
I think there are different ways of thinking about this. There's the idea of universal basic income. There's also consideration of what it is that we actually invest in terms of public services and public infrastructure, so that those people who are on very low incomes are still able to access healthcare, good quality education, dental care. So I think there's a whole issue around the kinds of services and access that's provided alongside income. And of course, I think Barney touched on this, that a new form of inequality, or perhaps it's not so new, it's just becoming more important, is the digital divide. And those people that don't have access to the technology that's connecting us. This is an issue, as Barney said, for older people, but it was also an issue and continues to be in Victoria during lockdown for children who are at school and don't have the technology to be able to access the kinds of learning resources that they need. So how do we invest in those things at a public level to ensure that alongside income we also have access to those essential services? So I think there are a number of ways of thinking about this, but we've seen so much evidence that New Start is simply too low, and we've seen what's happened when it's been increased. And I think Barney's reference to dignity is so important there. And so when it comes to JobSeeker or New Start, we cannot keep people in poverty permanently in the way that we have been. So whether it's universal basic income, whether it's other measures, we have to find a solution to that. Some of that's got to be around redistribution.
From Iqbal is asking, there is of course a massive economic cost we're paying as a result of this unprecedented pandemic. However, on the positive side, we have an opportunity to reflect and fine-tune our spiritual being. Iqbal says, Sharon, you touched on this issue. I'm wondering what the other panelists think about this. We might start with you, Kate.
Oh, yeah, sure. So what was about spirituality, did you say?
Spiritual being, yeah, how we can fine-tune our spiritual being out of this.
I think it's a perfect opportunity. I think most of us live very fast, busy lives that we spend most of the time commuting in meetings and running from one place to the other. And this is a time now where I think we've all been forced to slow down, to perhaps distance ourselves from our usual activities. And I don't think it matters whether or not you're part of an organised religion or whether or not you find your spirituality in nature or in your family and friends. I think this is the time where we can actually focus a little bit more on, you know, what is the meaning? Why are we here? What's all around us, and actually appreciate all of that, because I do think sometimes that we just rush from one day to the other without actually having the time to sit back and reflect a little bit. I know that I've spent a lot more time with ocean swimming, underwater, taking photos of fish and things, which is one of my favourite things to do. And it just made me realise that I didn't actually miss going to shopping malls or, you know, doing those things that we think are so important at the time and that we think give us pleasure. But when you pull it all back, what gives us pleasure is usually our family, our social contacts and friends, the purpose that we have in our life, so the meaning that we have. And that for me might be my medicine and what I contribute to the community that way. But for other people, it might be being a member of their spiritual community or being a volunteer, all of those things. And, you know, and nature. And I think there's not much more to life than that. Everything else is sort of a superfluous addition. So I think this is the perfect time to really explore what life means to you as a person.
Mirko, as a businessman, I think I often struggle with this, thinking, yes, we've pulled back a lot, but with that pulling back, perhaps sometimes we haven't gone out and supported our businesses, and I think that's where this divide is. Do you see, like, just not necessarily on that spiritual level, but do you see people hunkering down a little bit more and therefore not coming out, maybe even amongst your business colleagues, not necessarily in the automotive industry?
Oh, look, definitely. I mean, you know, I'd be busy every second night of the week, pre-pandemic, you know, always going to some function or just a business meeting or just a get together with some other business people. I'm rarely doing that now.
How does that affect you? But that's a big part of your business, but also your social life. Are you okay with that? Was that a bit of a bit liberating, or actually at a loss?
Well, my wife loves it. Because I'm at home a lot more. I do spend a bit more time with the kids as well, which is great. Look, I've accepted it. It's part of what's changed over the last few months. You know, we need to obviously do it from a safety point of view to try and reduce the risk of any potential spread, but also to, you know, to reflect and spend more time with people that are the most important, and, you know, think about the business from the outside in, and think about what we can do to preserve our operation, and just keep it going by whatever innovation we need to bring in.
And I think a lot of that, as we've heard from several of you tonight, a lot of it comes from various aspects. Sometimes the home is not the safest place to be, and often work or school, you know, is a break from that. So seeing, it's just such a complex web of intricacies and difficulties and challenges, and as you've highlighted tonight, opportunities as well. Barnie, I'll end on you. What have you found from a spiritual perspective? What have you tapped into out of this?
I'll reflect on a couple of things that what I've done is I've done a reset with some of my colleagues at work and elsewhere to say, right, fine, after the first wave, let's do a reset, and let's ask ourselves what's the way looking forward. And as part of that reset, what I found is that there were many more people who would have a meal together at night and have a conversation. With children, with family, which was not normally something that would have happened. You know, as we all reflect, you know, we just carry on with the work and your commute and and all those things. So that's the first thing. The second thing was that what I found is I found people who were unselfishly engaging in supporting another. And it made me think of something that my father taught me. And he said that sometimes, you know, if you're inability to do so, then it's if you want to feel better about yourself, help somebody else, and that you'll learn so much from that exercise. And I think from that level of spirituality, there's much to learn, and much to grow from going forward. And that's why I've reflected on, you know, what you need to do within your community. It's so important. You know, I'm asking myself the question: how many of us know our neighbours? You know, how many of us have a chat with a neighbor and understand who the people are that surround us, and, you know, what they might need? Because it's so often is that we just, you know, in our own lane, and that's all that we do. And maybe it's time to just, you know, use the healing that we're experiencing maybe at the moment subconsciously to say, well, let's embrace that, and do something about that. Well,
thank you, Barnie. And I wonder how different this conversation would be if we were in Melbourne. I often think of that, and I know we are very lucky here in the ACT. And Kate, you're in Sydney. We still, you know, we still feel that we have, you know, we've been able to manage it well, luck or chance or good management. But Melbourne certainly, I think they would be having a very different discussion. Do you think? Would you agree with me if we were having this down there? We still seem to have a sense of optimism and on it here in the ACT. But I thank you all so much for your perspectives tonight and for everything you've brought. Thank you so much for the questions from the participants who've joined us at home, perhaps in tracksuit pants. Yes, it's another great opportunity. And before I end, I've got a couple more updates on my questions here. Yes, thank you, Alan. This is the Brains Trust. Alan says the bird flu outbreak in Victoria has been managed by depopulating infected flocks. No human health risks involved. And Syed was asking about the fumigation earlier, and but he's saying what I meant was the deep fumigation of business premises after COVID positive is too late, rather than we should encourage businesses, including clubs and gyms and medical centres, to undertake regular and more frequent fumigation, including you know, doing various disinfection towers and processes. So it's all to play out. But before I hand you back to your homes, I'd just like to invite Muhammad Ali. Muhammad, are you there? Just to come back and send us out.
No.
No.
Oh, he's on mute.
Hello, Muhammad. We'll wait patiently, or perhaps.
No, he's on mute, Lish.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe Lish, maybe we can go to Helen for the vote of thanks.
Okay, let's go to you, Helen.
Thank you very much. From all of the questions and the discussions, this pandemic is leading us to paths unknown. And we have lots of choices. From Sharon, how can we use a crisis to change society? From Kate, how can we use disruption to grasp the positives? And from Mirko, what are the opportunities for new technologies to build business opportunities as we build community? From Barnie, to encourage connections, social housing, to recognise the need for dignity for us all, with leaders who walk with us, and to encourage us to build a society that welcomes rather than exacerbates the physical distances of 1.5 metres. In this new world, we need some creativity to find ways that will continue to work Australians to stay together in all of our different forms and shapes and sizes. Thank you to everybody, and especially thanks to our MC for keeping us all together. Thank you and good night.
And thank you all for joining us, and many more Forum Australia events. If this is your first, thank you for joining us online, and may one day we meet back at the Taj Agra for a wonderful meal and a wonderful forum there, and join us in the future. Thank you again, Muhammad Ali. I think your audio's back on now, but thank you.
No, such a great pleasure, and thank you very much. We'll be back.
Good night.
Good night.